Hello, my name is Larry Dobrow. I'm MM+M's executive editor, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to a sponsored podcast with Intouch Group. This podcast, we're going to talk a little bit about Intouch's journey to foster inclusion and diversity so that its culture translates into inclusive healthcare marketing. Something that we cover all the time. I don't think there are too many organizations that do it as well as Intouch does. We're going to talk a little bit about how Intouch helps its clients improve the health outcomes of all their patients, but especially patients from historically marginalized communities. And for this conversation, I'd like to welcome Antonio Rivera, who is the Director of Inclusion Strategy, and Cecilia Aragones, who is the Senior Talent Acquisition Manager of Diversity Strategy at Intouch Group. Cecilia, Antonio, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Larry.
All right. It's become almost standard for our podcast at this point. It used to be we'd start with some big kind of flourish of big picture, what's going on. But let's start with this. How are you? How are you and yours? How is Intouch weathering everything that we've experienced over the last 13 months now?
I'm great. I think I will have to use some of the language that I've acquired in the last 2 years as part of some of the internal initiatives and say I am highly engaged, overall feeling nice and well. My well-being levels are pretty good. But I will say that I can't speak for every single person at the agency. We're so far doing great in terms of growth. But we're listening, and there's pockets of people feeling like, this pandemic is taking a toll. And while engagement for the whole agency is high, we measure that every 6 months. We've learned for some of the most recent publications from Gallup that there's a divergence happening of engagement and well-being, and we think we're getting closer to kind of identify like how pervasive is this at our agency. But generally, agency is doing great, very agile and adapting to the new normal. But I think some people are experiencing, just like the rest of America, some anxiety, some issues that is taking a toll. But generally speaking, I'm grateful to be employed and working and doing what I love and feeling like there's an impact at the end that's relative to the very thing we're dealing with as a global community. So yeah, it's, a bit of a mixed answer, but I think it's as honest as I can be.
Mixed is good. I think we're all feeling some degree of PTSD at this point.
Right. Yeah.
Cecilia, on your end, how are you? How are you and yours? How has everything been from where you sit at Intouch Group?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Much like many people, at the start of the pandemic, it was a really tricky time. It was really hard for, myself. It was hard for my family. It was hard, as an agency, there was just so much uncertainty, around what was happening. And so it was a tough time, but I think, as we were chatting about earlier, it's been a little over a year now, and we've all kind of learned to adapt to this new normal. And I have to say, I'm really proud of how we responded, to the pandemic, and proud of how we responded to other issues surrounding the pandemic as an agency. And it's just been really rewarding to work for an agency that is genuinely dedicated to making impactful change. Working in the life sciences space, working in the pharma space has been, throughout all of this, has been, quite of a learning experience, and it's just been rewarding, overall. And so I feel really good about where we're at right now.
I think both of you touched on this a little bit, but let's talk about your specific roles. How challenging has it been to perform roles that you're doing during this last year? I mean, there's been social unrest, there's been political stratification, there's been horrendous health inequity. How challenging has it been to do D&I and do it as well as Intouch does over while we're also dealing with the pandemic?
I'm programmed to be optimistic, and so in a lot of what I'll say will always have a little tinge of like, oh, okay, this is a positive outlook. But I feel that it's been challenging, but it wasn't. And actually, to take some cues from our purpose, that there is no challenge too big to cure. And that is so true. I think the inclusion strategy journey started before the catalyst that was the murder of George Floyd. It was something that we embarked on at least a year and a half. And this is after the agency's been around for 19 years that we kind of looked around and said, let's be more intentional with how we create an irresistible workplace culture. And let's look to inclusion to help us do that. And let's look at how we really maximize our ability to connect with new communities of patients by having diversity of people be one of the KPIs of whether or not we're getting inclusion right. And part of inclusion really is about creating spaces for hard conversations, for a lot of self-learning, self-reflection, an awareness of your own biases, the barriers. And then a lot of it is about empathy. And so we were equipped with three things, I think, leading into the pandemic that has paid off. One is empathetic leadership. It's a strength of ours. I think across the board, there's an awareness and an understanding and appreciation that you can't just be a manager. That's important, yes, but we need you to be a coach. And as part of our inclusion strategy, we need our coaches to be inclusive leaders as well. And so a strength that we had coming into it was a community of leaders, senior leaders that were empathetic. And that helps a lot when you're leaning in and trying to identify what might be some potential issues, some clogs in the flow of things, right? So we had that. And so that helped with the challenges a lot. And I'll get into it as I kind of list off the other two things. The second was when we talk about modern marketing, we talk about personalized experiences a lot. So me having 15 years of digital marketing experience and working at Intouch for a year and a half as a senior social media strategist, of course, there wasn't a huge departure from that very premise in a lot of what we do in terms of an inclusive culture. So we have a personalized support approach from a people and culture perspective. So a lot of what we do is create moments where we can listen to what's being said and ideate solutions that work for as many people as possible, but specifically to groups. And so we try to really find opportunities for dialogue, for whether it's a survey or a focus group or just conversations, check-ins, frequent check-ins with pockets. We had a whole spreadsheet of all the people we had to keep checking in and on, and HR and everyone. It was like a shared document. So we really approach support from in a personalized way. And that kind of has its own thread of like tactics and ways that we do that. But the premise is like, how do we be personalized in our ways to support employees, the 1,300 employees? And then lastly, the community. There's a strong community, and the things that go into a strong community is being vulnerable, having positive experiences, and having tough, hard conversations, but coming out of it. So those three things, plus kind of like the inclusion strategy and what that meant in terms of our decision to deploy certain curriculums and the learning journeys that we design in L&D, and also kind of, in general, maximizing the strengths of leadership. It really helped us to live up to the challenge. And so it was challenging, it was hard, but I feel as though we've done a good job using those three strengths to listen and to respond and to communicate. And so I think it's been really hard, but I feel like we've lived up to the challenge. Our numbers are great in terms of numerical things. The qualitative stuff is great. We're listening to the feedback, but there's always more work to be done, and that's how we're approaching it. But I think it was a challenge. Farouk wasn't a big fan of working from home. He'll say it, and in the beginning, like before this whole thing started, his idea was like, like you need to be in proximity, kind of that thinking, which is typical.
Right?
And he literally is like now we have hybrid, we just launched it. Now everything's changing to hybrid. And so there's options of how you want to interact with, workspace is now the physical thing. So there's a lot of evolutions happening, but it's because we had a lot of strengths and values that positioned us to confront those challenges.
That's good. Cecilia, a question for you, following up on some of what Antonio just said. Doing this, becoming so intentional in promoting equity, fostering inclusion, increasing diversity. What were some of the barriers? What were some of the challenges that Intouch Group faced, and how did you get past them?
Yeah, I think, as Antonio had mentioned, we had already started having these conversations. We had already started doing, this work. I think, what happened with the pandemic is that, you know, we took a step back, and I think that, you know, I think it motivated a lot of people. It supercharged what we were already doing, right? And it put us in a position to rethink, you know, our approach in as far as hiring. It's also, you know, allowed us to kind of rethink how we go about shaping our culture, right? Because this idea of like what our culture was, you know, essentially what our culture was, you know, pre-COVID is not necessarily what it is now. And that's been hard. That shift has been a little bit hard for our employees. It's been hard in terms of like for our talent, you know, team to really sell these things, you know, to prospective talent, you know, because of the changes and things like that. But I'd have to say that, you know, again, I'm really proud of how we responded. I think the difference is that we are taking action now. You know, we are really grounding ourselves. Again, we are being intentional about crafting actionable strategies around these things. You know, in having conversations with like friends and family and things like that, I always say that, you know, during this time, we saw two pandemics. We saw the, you know, pandemic, we saw COVID, and we also saw a racial pandemic happen. And this has required us, you know, it requires, in terms of interacting with talent and interacting with our employees, it requires a certain level of emotional intelligence too. So in that, then, you know, again, to Antonio's point, it's opened up opportunities for us to have those very hard but necessary conversations. And from those conversations, we've been able to build out like these new strategies that just have genuinely worked for our efforts, right? So I think, you know, at the start of the pandemic, we saw that this work was impacted the most, right? So I think there was like Glassdoor published a report maybe a little over a year ago that stated that there was like a 60% decrease in the jobs, you know, available in this space. But then after, you know, amid the violence and amid the, you know, George Floyd's murder, we saw that shifted, right? And so when we talk about like actually recruiting in the space, you know, we saw some barriers in terms of like actual supply and demand. There's a lot of things that we had to overcome as far as like navigating the actual market and being more intentional about doing that, making sure that we have the resources, the tools in place to be smarter, make, you know, smarter, more data-driven decisions around how we go, you know, how we interact and attract talent. And making sure that we are keeping these things top of mind and targeting diverse talent and things like that. But having those conversations changes, right? And how we evaluate this talent needs to change. Like I feel like, you know, there were barriers, you know, that we had to overcome, but we are genuinely way more thoughtful and purposeful in this work, essentially.
I wanted to add, I made a list of some things because now, like, hearing the question asked again, I started to think, okay, well, some specific barriers to how the work translated in this new normal, you know, were some of these things that I just listed here. So one, the neurodiversity at our agency was becoming more and more important to consider. There are people that are living with dyslexia, who have dyslexia. There are people who are on the autism spectrum, who are autistic. There are people who are dealing with ADHD, right? Who live with ADHD. This a lot, and so and these people, more and more we are hearing directly from them. So there's a bit of an evolution of the stigma. So you know, when we first started, maybe about 15 or so people that openly share their kind of disability. And now there's about 37, 39. And that's in the last 18 months. We saw that uptick, and the amount of employees that we hired from a proportionate perspective, I don't think it explains it all the way. So in that we realize, like, okay, moving into a virtual only space, is not the most inclusive thing when you start to consider and respond to the feedback that a chat interface is very exhausting for someone with dyslexia. And we've kind of had it to, you know, basically partner with the managers. So one of the biggest barriers was, you know, confronting the barriers to engaging with technology that we had in our community and empowering the managers. And that became our response. Like, how do we empower the managers with the right awareness of what's going on and the right tools to lead conversations that get them to a agreement and a new approach to how you maybe start off a Zoom call, to how you share documents. So maybe not just present it for the first time on the call, maybe send it to the team so that they can process the information. So for people who are introverts, for example, who really don't want to be on a little rectangle speaking, but have a lot to contribute, they are afforded an opportunity to do so if you give them another avenue. So that was a big barrier, or, like considering the fact that everything is now a chat interface, a virtual thing. How do we integrate closed captioning and as many opportunities that we can for the people who are deaf in our community? That was something that we dealt with. So that was a big thing that we had to deal with. We couldn't just assume, yeah, everything's Zoom, everything's great. Like, no, people are dealing with these disabilities, these disorders. But then also, people are also not wanting to be on camera because they collectively experience trauma that's going on. So our Asian community, our Black employees, our Mexican employees, sometimes they don't want to be on a Zoom call. So that was that was another thing. That's the second thing is the social unrest contributed to how people felt like they needed to show up, and it was exhausting. So we, again, talked about how do you afford people an opportunity. So give an option to how people are on a call. They don't necessarily have to have their camera on. Give them the space where they feel like, if I have my camera off, I won't be stigmatized like, oh, I'm being antisocial. So that was the second thing. And then parents, wow, we heard a lot, and I think that's a big thing that we asked in the beginning, like, hey, how's everyone doing? We had a panel to talk about how people are experiencing the pandemic differently, and it created awareness. And then parents raised their hands, and there were a lot of parents. And so there was a lot of fatigue. And so we created a therapy. We created a benefit for the parents to use. And then social isolation. A lot of people living alone. That was a barrier for us. So it's like, how do we combat that? So we had a lot of barriers we were confronted with, but and as we speak, we're kind of figuring out ways to address it. But I think the biggest thing that we've done is really try to listen at scale.
I would have to agree with that. And that's definitely, we evaluate our hiring process from that same lens, right? Understanding that as we're interacting with candidates, these are things that we have to keep top of mind, that they're also going through these things, they're experiencing these things at the same rate as we are, to the same extent that we are. And so how do we put them in a position to shine in these conversations, right? How do we create like a safe space for a candidate, right? And then, so it's just been about, again, it's been about rethinking those things. And I think that, that's one great thing that came out of this situation, or these experiences, these current events, is that it put a spotlight on the things that we, like our biggest areas of opportunity, things that we need to focus our attention on, and things that we probably would have overlooked and, if not put in this situation. So I think that's something that we benefited from greatly. And it's allowed us to, again, overhaul our process and rethink just our approach and having these conversations and interacting with talent on a daily basis.
Here's a question for you both, prompted by both of your last answers. We talk about some of the barriers in terms of dyslexia, in terms of anxiety, in terms of just not wanting to be on camera. And that's certainly part of it. But is another barrier maybe that historically the healthcare marketing business really, I don't think it was out of any spite or anything like that, but historically the healthcare marketing business really didn't pay a lot of attention to some of these issues. Do you feel over the course of the last year, between everything around Black Lives Matter and everything around the pandemic, that maybe the industry has had a bit of an awakening of sorts of its own?
Yeah, I have seen such a transformation happen within this space. I was just looking at a report recently and looking at just the stats and the breakdown of the demographic breakdown of the industry. And you just can see that people both our competitors as well as our clients are also being intentional in this work. They're also being thoughtful, that they are being, they're being bold in their commitments to hiring diverse talent. They're being bold in their commitment to creating inclusive, environments for this talent to thrive internally. We're definitely seeing that shift happen, which is another push of ours, because we want to make sure that we're reflective of those changes that are occurring within our industry, right? And that more, even further than that, we're wanting to make sure that our work, that our clients' work is reflective of the greater, patient communities that they serve, right? And their clients, and that's ever changing. So that is definitely put, not a pressure, but that's definitely been something that we've taken on as like, yes, this is the direction that we're going. Even in talking to candidates, they're starting to notice the shift, which has been really awesome. So to be a part of that has been definitely rewarding. But for sure, I've definitely seen that shift happen.
And what's beautiful is that, again, I keep talking about it because I almost want to talk about before and after the pandemic, obviously, but then even the moment where the social unrest, the catalyzing moment, which I think is important to acknowledge. And so we are seeing, to your point, so there's three kind of areas when you're talking about your own personal journey. I'm going to be talking about this at the Brand Lab Fearless Conference that's next week on April 15th. Day 1 of 2. Day 1 is about me. Day 2 is about we. And the whole idea is like, hey, so we had a reckoning. Now what? So it's interesting that you're saying this. And my workshop is about how do you become the best ally to really be a part of the movement. And so what I've realized and what we realized as an organization that came in handy, but we had to kind of augment it and increase the velocity at which we did the thing, which is that our clients are looking, of course, this is obvious. Our clients are always looking for us to lead them. And in this case, they were having the same awareness. Whoa, can you help us be more anti-racist? We were getting emails with the word racist in it. And I felt like, I was like, look at this beautiful cultural artifact. There's a moment in this organization where the word racist entered the vernacular, and that's powerful. And so then we were getting an uptick of clients asking their agency rosters, us specifically, hey, help us become more inclusive, help us become more diverse, right? These things get thrown around. And what we realized is we needed to, and I say we, me in collaboration with my partners in HR, but also in the learning and development group, and actually my executive sponsors of the key group. So, Angela Tenuta and the account services, one of the largest groups, David Winhausen's in the dev team, one of the largest groups. We have these large communities of employees. We realized that we needed to make sure that we empowered their ability to meet the challenge of our clients' requests, which really takes a strong awareness of self and a lot of empathy, and then your ability to empathize strengthens your ability to become more culturally competent. So we've started to offer things such as the inclusivity assessment that looks at the employee experience and identifies opportunities for the brand to be more inclusive relative to different social groups, and really starts at the research and how you look at data. We have now UX offerings that hone in on inclusion design and accessibility, and we have all these things. And so everybody that touches those pieces of business, including all the account people that are meant to support the collaboration process, they are afforded either on-demand opportunities to increase their awareness and understanding of concepts such as I&D, equity, what does that mean? How do we, and then increase their understanding of themselves. So we give them on-demand content opportunities, as well as assign them workshops, social learning, high-touch experiences, so that they can, because I've gotten emails from people saying, hey, my client wants me to be more representative, but we're a group of mostly white women that we're not quite sure how to approach this. And after a conversation, they felt like, wait a minute, okay, so yeah, I don't need to be black to be anti-racist. This is okay. And I gave them some resources. I kind of gave them a bit of a pep talk. That's my thing too. But but I point them in the direction, and they're like, okay, I can have the conversation with my client. I realize what's the most important thing. It's not about just the imagery. It's about the way we even look at data. So we have a confluence of resources, of conversations and awareness that's informing the type of work that we produce, but also the quality of that work. So it's been, to your point, an industry-wide awakening, and it's actually led to a lot of great work that iterates on what we've already been working on, but it increased the velocity at which we do it. And it's exciting to see, because we're starting to see it now happen outside of us. FDA, one of the things we always hear is like, hey, to put a black person in that composition would go against the clinical trials representation when we start to think of that person relative to the 3 other people in that composition. So they're not a quarter of the people that were in the clinical trials. And that's the constant reason why we stop ourselves for reflecting the diversity of the community, right? By way of a Black person. And that's just one slither of people, right? And what I've loved is that it's a pattern. It just happens. And it's because, but when we prescribe it, when doctors prescribe it, they don't refer to the clinical trials and say, I can't give this to you, you're Black. So FDA just recently released and said, hey, we actually need to start developing guidelines and pushing clinical trials to really try harder to be more inclusive. And what that is the same process. It's like, how do you build equity in the recruiting process? How do you target your audience and customize your message so that they listen to you better? That's marketing 101. So when you're recruiting for clinical trials and you're talking to a Black patient or a Black community, it's not the same message that you would with a community of white women, for example. So what's beautiful is that now the FDA is kind of coming around and helping us now to lead our clients to this new place where we do things not because they're politically motivated, but because they're rooted in a moment of reflection and a desire to really walk the walk and have footprints and not just echoes of what we want to do and say,
In light of that, some of these conversations you're having, whether it's with new job candidates, whether it's with internal audiences, whether it's with external audiences, is what are you hearing about its impact on the business? There's obviously, this is the right thing to do on myriad levels. It has been the right thing to do for a very long time, but a lot of the times there's also a business case. Tell me a little bit about the impact of some of these issues we've been discussing overall on the business.
I'll give you the perspective, like general, and then Zizi can maybe touch on what she's hearing from candidates and what they're looking for, what they're seeing. But in general, actually, business it's good. It's really great. There are a lot of organic growth happening, a lot of new opportunities in terms of positioning ourselves from a point of excellence with regards to this idea of inclusive marketing and what that really means and how we can do it better because we have a group that is highly empathetic, highly innovative, culturally competent. And so it's positioned us and put us in a point of strength in new business. We've used it to kind of stand out. We've gotten a lot. So we've been growing. We've been winning a lot. I forget. Can I even say it outside of the internal meetings? But our win rate is great post-pandemic, virtual setting. And the messaging that we're integrating into our selling story is reflective of this new kind of positioning of our inclusive capabilities. And so I would say generally, business has been great. We are now reaching a point where we're getting work specifically to tap into new communities. So we're seeing an uptick in selling this thing called the inclusivity assessment that looks for untapped audience. And the way that they're untapped is that they're a community of people with the unmet need that the client can meet. And the reason that they're unmet is because of some sort of perpetuated bias, right? Whether it's a lack of just not looking at the data that you had, right? So there's been a uptick in new selling, right? We've sold it in a few times to two huge clients. And it's because we're starting at the very top and saying, okay, before you even talk about imagery, let's help you look at your data. How are you researching? How are you segmenting your audience? And then we identify, wait, we have a slew of people that we can tap into because the act of promoting equity and being more inclusive reveals to us that we've been kind of ignoring them. And so there's been an uptick in a lot of that, and which has been great. And it's very rewarding. We've been approaching clients with that as a lead or a part of the story in terms of how do we tap into new communities? How do we help you, for example, combat, via a program in partnership with some media partners? How do we help you combat the hesitation towards the vaccine within the Black community? So we're kind of seeking out client, opportunities for us to bring our superpowers to combat that issue. And so I think, so overall, I think it's been helpful for the business. And of course, at moments it's uncomfortable. There's conversations happening that people are like, hey, Antonio, can you help me navigate? My client wants me to do this, or, hey, there's been, because there's always a balance of like change and resistance. But what's great is that, again, we're fortifying the managers, the account leads, the creative team with the data that they need and the kind of conversation that needs to be had to help navigate through any kind of like of the small changes relative to how we create new program. How do we, in fact, working with Abid, right? Abid and the AI equity, how do we build equity into our AI? We're selling a lot of AI. And so in working with Abid, we realized like part of what we sell needs to be a equitable process, which is to say that knowing that algorithms, just like human brains, are decisions made using a finite source of data. How do we, acknowledging that inequity and bias forms inevitably because it's human nature to start to form a bias, how do we sell in our work equitable processes that allow us to ensure that after 6 months of algorithm running, we're not perpetuating inequity? So I think, that's another kind of quick example of like, it's been impacting the business in a very positive way, affording us more opportunities, more areas to flex our superpowers.
Yeah, and I would say that that's been something, really awesome coming from, just looking at it from the talent acquisition lens, is being able to speak to the candidate, right? Because now and I would say even before the pandemic, even before, everything else that's been going on, current events, as racial tensions have grown across the country, even before all of this, candidates have started expressing, their desire to, join an agency whose values align with theirs. And a lot of those, falling within the space of, diversity and what we're doing, in terms of inclusive marketing and things like that. They want to see how we're putting this stuff in practice. They want to see how we are, how we are elevating diverse voices, and decreasing cultural bias, and how these things are leading to more positive, like social change. They want to be a part of that change. And they want to make sure that any, like the next organization that they join, again, aligns with those things. And so it's been awesome to be able to, again, communicate these things to candidates and really just show that we are, basically putting our money where our mouth is. We're thinking these through, and we're applying these frameworks in how we do, how we take on business and how we do our work in general. So, that's been really awesome on my side of the business, being able to speak to that and see us, evolve in that space too, because I wasn't able to have the same conversations with, candidates maybe 2 years ago. But we truly have evolved, and it's been awesome to share that with candidates. So,
to that end, I'm just going to throw one or two more questions at you guys. The first one is, obviously this is something which Intouch Group is committed to and done well. What are some of the pieces of advice that you dole out to organizations, whether they're on the client side or the agency side or anywhere else? The organizations that want to be better at this and aren't there yet, that are putting in a good faith effort, but aren't maybe seeing the same results that you guys are, without asking you to give up the secret sauce, of course. What are some of the pieces of advice that you would, that both of you would give out?
I don't have a secret sauce, Cece. I have, I look at it as art. Like what inclusion strategy and what it aims to do is, in my opinion, is like a bit of art. It's like any strategy, you drop it in a different group and they might interpret the strategy differently. And so art is a moment of vulnerability that inspires emotion. And so the strategy, I think, is something that I'm more than happy to share. And I think it's been working well. All the kind of leading and lagging indicators that we've talked about, because yes, we have a measurement plan. So I think, the advice I give is 3 parts. 1, look at the data. Start to look at the data related to the people you have. Lean in and start to look at data relative to social group representation. Start to even, maybe you might want to learn about what data should you be looking at, but just start to really lean into your people data and your people data relative to underrepresented groups. That includes the people about. So through, by way of, volunteering, the answer, you can get a sense of what diversity do we have at our organization. And does the data suggest X, Y, or Z? And what you might find is that the data suggests that, whoa, there's a bit of a bias. We haven't done anything to mitigate this effect. And we're so well-intentioned, but yet we keep hiring 90% X, Y, Z. So look at the data relative to your people, right? And that is obviously going to always be contextual to like, what is your goal, right? But I mean, just start to have the conversation around the people data relative to social groups. And you might kind of learn a lot just for taking the snapshot. So that's one thing. Two, empower your managers. Really focus on providing learning opportunities, because the biggest challenge that people have is a lack of self-awareness and cultural competency. And so as an organization, so the organization is one of the places where you get inclusion. So inclusion, you get it from the organizational practices, you get it from the behavior of individuals, right? And you get it from the stories that leadership says and repeats, right? And how leadership shows up and acts. And so I think at the very least, as an organization, we need to integrate a learning journey that supports managers in particular, but all people as they move along their personal journey from high degree of self-awareness to understanding of different cultures to bringing it all together for inclusion of action. And it's a continuum. So the second thing I would say is to really create a learning and development based strategy to providing continuous learning opportunities for your managers of people, but all people. And as you evolve, make that learning journey custom. So create custom curricula that will enhance your UX team. But that really starts with looking at the data. So, anyway, so that's the second thing. The third thing that I think is the biggest piece of advice is to practice at the very top what we're asking our employees to do. So senior leadership, they need to support the uptick of the movement as people go up in their journey. They need that oxygen. As you go up in the mountain, you need tools to help you keep breathing. So the leadership needs to be equipped with the means to support the uptick of stuff. So leadership, I think everyone who is the most influential, it has an E or a V or a P in their title, they need to really lean into their journey, right? So we lean into this idea of increasing your self-awareness. Bias is a manager's Achilles heel. So how do you become more self-aware? And then how do you become more empathetic and more culture? And so that you can support the movement that it will be coming up. So those are the three areas that I would say.
In having this conversation with people in working in my space, I always just say that, diversity and inclusion, it's like a lofty goal, right? It's something that you need. It's not something that you can accomplish all at once, right? And in fact, you're never going to be done with it. You're never going to be done with the topic. It's going to change. It's going to pivot based on technology. It's going to change based on expectations and motivations of people in this space. And so you can't really look at it as this one fixed thing. You have to always kind of keep an open mind, always, be questioning, and always, it requires, constant reflection, right? You have to become comfortable with having uncomfortable conversations. And from there, be engaged enough and motivated enough to create, again, actionable strategies. To go back to Antonio's point, data is key. It requires, this work definitely requires an assessment of what doesn't work. We have to uncover what our area, like the biggest area of opportunities are, where the gaps are, exist within the strategy, and be willing to, and really, really dive into that. It requires, a level of planning, of being proactive, as far as like recruiting in the space. You have to be proactive about reaching out to these underrepresented, markets and candidates. And you have to be, intentional in how you position yourself in these spaces. And it's all also about building, building and nurturing really strong relationships in this space. Relationships are key. And I think those are probably the biggest things that I recommend in terms of, just recruiting in this time, and just as far as, just recruiting from a lens of like diversity.
Just one last question for both of you guys. It's the crystal ball question, and it's a little bit unfair because the future is changing, every couple of hours nowadays. But how do we, as things, slowly return to something approximating normal, how do we make sure that the focus remains on these issues? There's going to be an impulse once people get back into the office to try to, get back into old habits and this and that. How do you keep yourselves intentional about these issues and to make sure that they don't just become, okay, we'll check in every couple of months, something that's a commitment on a day-to-day basis?
It's about rolling out policies and procedures and things like that to continue to hold us accountable to this work. That's necessary. in doing this work, so that when we do return to whatever version of normalcy we'll enter into, we're still being held to these commitments to these policies. I think that that's pretty key in making sure that we remain intentional and successful in this work.
I echo that. That would be my answer. I would add a sub bullet to that. And so like the integration of the inclusion strategy as part of the overall cultural renovation. So when we think about the agency's strongest asset is frankly the culture that keeps people and that attracts people. And so I would say that as part of that process, we have to integrate it into the business goals. And that will definitely keep us accountable over the long term as we look to them to help drive us. So how do we wrap these things into what we're kind of doing in terms of as an organization servicing our clients in a way that it becomes too tethered for us to untether it, or for it to happen by accident or by sheer lack of attention or intention. So that's actually one big thing that we're working on now as we continue to build on our business goals, is it really kind of integrating with that. And that's where this idea of inclusive marketing offerings starts to come to life a little bit. But yeah, I definitely echo that, Cece. Very true.
Antonio, Cecilia, I can't thank you guys enough for this. These are obviously important issues, and the fact that Intouch is generous enough to share its learnings with the broader healthcare marketing community. Good on you guys. Many thanks for this. And let's talk again about these issues sooner rather than later, right?
Sounds good.
Thank you, Larry. Appreciate it.
For having us
Thank you,
again.
MM+M.
And for the MM+M podcast, this is Larry Dobrow. Many thanks. Talk to you soon and be well.